Nice to see some familiar names and familiar faces out there. Welcome to the FEI Baltimore chapter's presentation of the value of an outsourced CFO. Thanks for inviting my partner Doug Zeisel and me to help provide an understanding of this topic. We think it's an interesting space to be in, obviously. We think there's opportunities for people that have similar backgrounds to us. A lot of small and even some medium-sized companies need that financial structure, that financial expertise, that financial assistance that they can't afford to buy on a full-time basis, and that's what we provide. I'd like to introduce Doug Zeisel, my partner at TCV Growth Partners. Doug and I will be presenting the information this afternoon, and hopefully it'll be of interest to you. TCV Growth Partners not only provides outsourced CFO services, but also other C-suite executive services for marketing, sales and marketing, for operations, for product development, for strategic planning, and a few other kinds of areas. There's 6 of us in the group, and we're excited about the prospects we see. We're starting to get a little bit of traction. Doug, you want to add anything to that? Doug, you're on mute.
I thought that was great, Dave. Great introduction, and I guess most everyone knows that Dave started his career with Ernst & Young as a CPA and moved up to the ranks, became a CFO for some different companies, and eventually became CEO of Arundel Federal Savings Bank. So I'm proud to have Dave as a partner. My background is very strange. I started off as a school teacher, went into business with a friend, and we sold that to a Fortune 500 company. And I've been in and out of entrepreneurship ever since. Master's degree in finance, an 8-year stint with Tatum as a CFO partner. And currently, Dave and I are doing the outsourced CFO work for our partnership, which is TCV Growth Partners. Thanks, Dave.
Sure. Again, nice to see some familiar names and faces out there. A couple of housekeeping items. If you need or want CPE, you need to make sure you respond to the polling questions. And just so you give you a little heads up, slide 5, 12, 16, 22, and 29. If you have somebody counting the slides as we go along while you're trying to do something else, you can get back to do the polling questions. We're going to try to do this interactive if we can. If you have a question that you want to ask, you'll need to unmute yourself, ask the question, and then we'll be able to hear you. But you can also put questions in the chat, and Denise will monitor the chat. And if you have a question that you put there, Denise will let us know that a question has appeared in the chat. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started here. How fractional CFOs add value to growing enterprises. Doug?
Yeah, so we're starting off this presentation with a question or a statement about why companies fail. And the reason this is important is we're talking about fractional CFO services for small to mid-sized companies. And as you all know, a horrendous number of startup companies fail. It's something greater than 50% within 3 years. And even companies beyond 3 years, there's a huge percentage of those that fail. Why do they fail? Well, frequently it's because of management issues. If you think about it, there's a lot of third generation family-owned businesses out there, and that third generation doesn't have the fire in the belly the founders had to move it forward. That's one reason. You can also have market misalignment. Oh, by the way, in terms of management issues, I happen to be a certified turnaround professional, and an old saying in that in the turnaround world is that the management that gets you into trouble isn't the management that will get you out of trouble. So, I mean, management issues are key. You also have market misalignment. And what is that? That is when you've been running along your company the same old way and the market starts to shift. So today we see that a lot. There's so many disruptive companies out there, Carvana in the auto industry. In fintech, you have Stripe and PayPal. The list goes on and on. You can find a list of 50 of those online pretty easily. There's also disruption in healthcare. Another reason companies fail is the loss of momentum. So again, they're cruising along at the same speed, and then new competitors come in, and they're not keeping an eye on the competition. They lose momentum, and the other companies take over the markets. Running out of cash. You can actually run a business, you can grow a business so fast that you run out of cash. There is an incredible inflection point in terms of growth, where if you're not quite bankable yet, you can run out of cash if you're growing your sales too fast. Why is that? Well, your receivables grow faster than the cash coming in, and yet you're growing your expenses quite rapidly to support the sales growth. So running out of cash is a critical area. And of course, then we have not operating profitably. So my question to the group is, which of the above, and I'm happy for anyone to chime in, which of the above can a seasoned financial professional help prevent? Thoughts?
This over chat, or do you want to do it verbally?
Be happy to have you do it verbally.
Running out of cash is my experience 98% of the time.
It's a good one.
Exactly the reason why you mentioned.
The others?
I think the management issue, I've seen it a few times where family businesses, the first generation had the idea, were good at it, and the second and third generation not so much, and it loses its momentum.
So I would submit that a seasoned financial professional can help out in all those areas, probably the least in the management area in terms of getting that management team to do the right thing, but they could still be effective there, because if they provide them with the right information, which is one of their jobs, giving them the numbers and of how things are going, say in sales and operations, then hopefully management will actually do something to prevent it. You can also say that a financial professional can help keep a company in market alignment, because they can create the metrics in which a company will see that, hey, our sales are slowing down, our sales in a certain product line are slowing down. Maybe we need to look at this and do something. Same with loss of momentum. However, the key areas that they can help are, yes, running out of cash and keeping the operation running profitably. So, Dave, how about if you take over from here?
Sure. Well, I know a lot of you on the call today have been CFOs, and you know that the role of the CFO has changed dramatically in recent years, whereas the primary role used to be kind of keeping the debits and the credits straight. That's not true anymore. That's been pushed down to the controller. And the CFO is really responsible for more strategic emphasis in the company as the CEO's wingman, making sense of the numbers for the CEO and the executive group, but also challenging the CEO and the executives. If there's something that's gone awry, the metrics aren't working out, the trends aren't meeting expectations. And the CFO is the fellow or the lady, the person, I should say, who can step into the fray and make sure to hold the whole group accountable with what's going on in the business. The certainly the oversight of the accounting and finance department is a big role of the CFO. But like I mentioned, the debits and the credits, the bookkeeping, the payables, receivables has kind of been pushed down to the controller level person. Even to some extent, cash flow monitoring. I'll say the controller is good at cash flow monitoring for today and looking backwards. The CFO typically will get involved looking forwards in what's going on with cash flow and what the cash flow needs are going forward. As Doug mentioned, the metrics for the whole business, not just the finance and accounting area, is important. And the CFO typically is driving that. But the metrics can relate to all the different operations of the company, not just the finance and accounting area. And then the treasury function, the use of cash, the sources of cash, and the spending of cash. Typically, the CFO, if there's not a treasurer in the company, and typically we're looking at small to medium-sized companies in terms of today's talk, there wouldn't be a treasurer, but the treasury function of how to manage cash it comes under the governance of the CFO. So the CFO agenda, you guys are doing that every day when you come in your role as a CFO. You need to be a strategic partner to the CEO. You need to be able to explain what the numbers mean, not just what the numbers are, but what the numbers mean to the CEO and to the executive team. You need to kind of make sure that the rest of the executive team understands what's important in the numbers and what's just kind of noise in the numbers. And from your experience in looking at these numbers throughout your careers, what's important and what's kind of chafe, as we have in the presentation here. CFOs are involved in strategic planning these days because strategic plans involve looking forward. What's the financial impact of activities that are planned in the company going forward, whether it's new product, new services, growth, and how to finance all of that stuff. And then what are the critical value drivers of the business? Is it EBITDA? Is it growth in sales? Is it getting out of a cash burn situation if you're a startup? What's driving the value of the company going forward? Communication is probably one of the key roles of the CFO, and I know that all you guys who are CFOs know that's not always easy. Certainly delivering financial information to non-financial people is sometimes difficult. Delivering difficult information to people who aren't expecting it is sometimes difficult. But you can also deliver non-standard financial reports or information about other parts of the business to people who are on the executive team. And that's where the metrics and the dashboards come about. Obviously, supervising the controller and the accounting staff is an important element of the CFO role. And then, as I had mentioned, direct and reviews the forecasting, looking out going forward, 1, 3, and 5-year plans. Certainly, you want to look at cash flows out 1 to 2 years, potentially, maybe even beyond that if you've got some big growth plans coming, where you're going to get the financing for that growth. And then 5-year plans are good for investors or strategic or boards of directors. They kind of want to know what your strategies are going to do or going to look like going out 5 years or more. The other part of the CFO role is the interface with accounting and the senior managers in other parts of the business. You also make presentations at board meetings. You're the face of the company with investors, with lenders, with auditors, and you develop those lending relationships to provide the financing, bank financing, if it's needed from time to time. I tell my clients that you really should have a line of credit with a financial institution. Getting the line of credit when you don't need it is easier than getting one when you do need it. So having that in your back pocket, if you ever need access to cash that comes about a little bit unexpectedly, certainly having that line of credit is helpful. And with that, we are at our first polling question. Okay. Thankfully, almost 90% of you said that you would consider engaging a fractional CFO, which is good news for Doug and I, since that's the business that we're in. Can everybody see this results for the polling question? Only 2 weren't sure. So hopefully in the rest of the presentation, we'll be able to convince you that fractional CFOs really do bring value. Okay, Denise, we can move on.
Yes. If the box doesn't close, just click it closed in the upper right-hand corner.
Gotcha.
Good.
Thanks.
So,
All right, Doug, back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. So, looking at the essential finance functions, Dave's reviewed those somewhat in terms of the CFO agenda. But when you're considering the growth trajectory of a firm, which of these really starts out? Which of those comes first? Anyone like to chime in on that?
You collect those accounts receivable.
Yep, that's quite important. That's one of the top ones. So I'd submit that the first 4 are the ones that a company institutes first. And the last ones are the ones that come afterwards, at least in terms of importance. It would be hard to rank those, but they're all quite important. But typically, early stage companies don't do much in the area of managing cash flow, not that much in budgeting, forecasting, reporting. They don't have that much reporting to do, and their strategic and tactical planning. Wow, who helps them with that? So let's move on to the next slide. So in terms of the progression of a finance department as a company grows, so we have early stage to startup. And I have to say the next few slides, these are fungible. You can't clearly delineate between each of these stages, but we're throwing these up here as examples. But starting off with a founder who starts a company and he's trying to do everything. And the first thing he does typically is hire an office manager who might help out with some of the finance related activities, those lower level activities we talked about. So typically they use QuickBooks, and back in the day, any of you who are old as I am might remember there was Peachtree Accounting as a competitor, but I don't think Peachtree's around much anymore. QuickBooks to enter invoices and manage payables. So the office manager might help out with that. The owner might be doing that still. But they'll definitely contract, if they have any sense, with an accounting firm to help them with monthly QuickBooks close. In fact, they'll contract with an accounting firm to help them set up QuickBooks properly, to help them with the close, to do the production of monthly accounting statements, financial statements, and to do their year-end tax work. So that's at the early stage. Dave, can you move on?
Yep.
So then the next stage is the company's experiencing revenue growth and they've achieved positive cash flow. Here, the owner is still trying to do everything, but perhaps at this stage, he hires a bookkeeper to help take some of the accounting load off of the office manager and off himself. So now he's starting to offload responsibility. And someone still managing QuickBooks, doing the invoicing, entering vendor payables, and preparing checks to be sent to vendors. Also payroll can be done at this point by the office manager or more than likely the owner. And there someone internally is doing the monthly close, but they still don't have a finance person doing this stuff. And that's a danger. And the accounting firm responsibility shifts to, doing the reconciliations and review of the monthly closeout, making sure things look proper, and doing production of the financial statements. And obviously they're doing the tax work. So as the company progresses to the next Dave.
Yep. I think
you
I'm
are-
there. Yep.
Stable revenues. So now you're talking about a smaller business, say $5 to $20 million in revenues. The owner now starts to really offload senior management responsibilities. He's perhaps hired a sales manager, perhaps hired a production manager, and hopefully at this point, or maybe even before this point, somewhere in this range, he's hired a controller. And the controller now takes over the load of all the finance stuff that they are prepared to do, such as doing, of course, the monthly financial statements are now done internally. They're managing an accounts payable person or an accounts receivable person, or maybe they're doing it themselves. It depends on how big the company is. And the bookkeeping responsibilities may shift to the controller because the controller can probably do it more accurately and more efficiently, say, than the office manager. And certainly the founder of the company doesn't want to be doing those sorts of things. The accounting firm continues to be a very critical part of the company's finance work. They produce compiled or reviewed financial statements as might be required by a lender or by, if they're a government contractor, something like that. Next slide. So now we get to a small business that's really grown up, stable, growing revenues, 25 million or more. They build out that senior management team. So now they're executives, not just a sales manager or a production manager. They're actually senior executives now. This could happen at 25 million or lower, but somewhere around here, they're going to hire a CFO who's going to oversee all the accounting and financial related activities. And he will fulfill the CFO agenda as Dave presented. So here's what the financial department organization chart will look like. Obviously, the CFO reports to the CEO, but reporting to him are the controller, the treasury department. Treasury department might be under the controller. It depends on the company. But the controller has reporting to him collections, payroll, payments, and bookkeeping. But an essential thing to remember here is the CFO, if he's a good one, is going to be keeping an eye on all these things. So ultimately, he's responsible. Even though these other departments, other people might be reporting to the controller, CFO needs to know what's going on. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Denise.
So we're on polling question number 2.
All set, guys, sharing results.
So kind of a mixed response in this, and that's okay because there is no one answer to this question, but 47% thought that specific industry experience was important, and I can't argue with that. I guess next up would be having a CPA as the fractional CFO, and certainly the CPA certificate and the experience that typically brings is a great experience for an outsourced or fractional CFO. Strong cultural fit with your executive team. That's very true as well. You might have the best qualifications in the world, but if you're not a cultural fit, you won't be able to be effective in your role. And master's in accounting, kind of low on the list. A little bit more expertise in the accounting area than might be necessary for a fractional CFO, but certainly brings valuable insights as well. So we will move on.
So I just want to say I'm grateful to you all for this, responding the way you did, because I don't have a CPA. I'm a certified practical accountant. So I feel like, oh, okay, Dave.
Okay. Some of the pitfalls that we have seen, both from experience and anecdotally with talking with others that we have seen with early stage companies, is that the Treasury Department is the owner's or the CEO's checkbook. And, you know, that tells you basically what happened yesterday and maybe what's going on today, but it's not going to tell you what's going to happen next week or next month or next year. So there's no cash flow forecasting. All you know is what you have in the bank. There's no budgeting that's going on with variance analysis. And as you guys know, in your roles as CFOs of companies, this is a pretty valuable tool for using. And we try to stress that with all of our clients. There's no financial statement forecasting. You know, and that's helpful in a growth stage. You need to really know what's going on or what's expected to happen in the future, even though, you know, it's never going to be 100% accurate. But it's always good to have an idea of what's going to happen or what you expect to happen so that you know the steps that you need to take along the way to try to make those things happen, because that's what you're trying to achieve. And there's no growth strategy that incorporates the realistic financial information. In other words, you have a growth strategy in your mind, maybe as the owner or the CEO, the entrepreneur. But if you don't communicate that to others in the organization and define what steps everyone needs to take to achieve that growth strategy, then it'll never happen. And this is kind of what we see in early stage companies, what we hear about. I'm not so sure that, you know, at this stage, the outsourced CFO or the fractional CFO is going to bring a lot of value. A lot of times this is an area where survival is key, but the CFO can help you structure the processes and the systems that enable you to look forward. So stage two is you're starting to get some traction with your product or service. You're starting to achieve some growth in revenues and in headcount probably. So you start to think about how do you finance that growth and how much growth do you expect to achieve, do you want to achieve? So everybody thinks that banks are the first place to turn to, and if you have a certain stable revenue base, profitability base, you might be able to turn to a bank, but a lot of times you're going to turn to venture capital funds or private equity funds, depending on your maturity of your business, to bring funds into the company that are going to finance the growth. The question that whether it's a bank or whether it's a VC or a private equity firm that you're talking to, the question they're going to ask is, you know, what are you going to do with the money that you raise? And how are you going to be able to pay us back if it's a bank, or provide a return to a venture capital firm or private equity firm? So you need somebody on board who can answer those kinds of questions, who understands the source or the reason behind those questions, and can respond to those questions from the bank or from the VC or private equity firm. So, the bank, the private equity guys or the VC guys, they're going to want to see a lot of documents before they give you the first dollar to help you finance your growth. And, owners typically don't have time to do all that stuff. They don't understand the reason for the questions. They think their product is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that anybody could see that. But that's not true when you're talking to banks and private equity and VC guys. They want to see the documents. They want you to know about your company. They want you to be able to demonstrate what the future of the company is going to look like. And typically it's the CFO or the outsourced CFO who can provide that kinds of information. So at a certain point too, in your growth stage, you get to the point where you need a team, and particularly the private equity guys, before they'll invest any money, they're going to want to make sure that your executive team can achieve the growth goals that you're talking with the private equity guys about, and be able to provide that exit or that future return for private equity investors. So CFO is a big part of that team, but you're going to have some others in addition to the CEO as well. Next stage, you've got a stable revenue base. You've got a controller in place. Does that make you bankable? Maybe. Typically, controllers are strong with debits and credits. They're focused on today and yesterday, what happened yesterday, to make sure they've got all the accounting entries in the right spot. But they're not as focused on the future as a CFO would be. Doesn't have the experience to kind of think that way typically. I'm not saying that's true of every controller, but a lot of times that's what you find. And then, does the controller have the experience in the different loan types that, you might be talking to a bank about? And the same thing goes with venture capital or private equity guys. If you're talking to them, controllers, typically don't have that kind of experience. Not all CFOs do either. So, if you're interviewing for a potential outsourced or fractional CFO, you want to make sure that they have experience that's going to help you, kind of going back to our prior polling question. Make sure they've got the experience that can help you solve your problems. Other problems, having the time in a day to develop and monitor budgets, forecasts, metrics, and cash flow forecasting. You might not think those are important, but when you get to this stage of your growth, you're really going to start to understand that these are pretty important things. It's important to know what's going on day to day and historically in the business, but it's even more important, I think, to know what is going to happen or what you are planning to happen, what you are working hard to achieve happen in the future. And the CFO typically has experience with all of these things. But the CFO actually also has the big picture thought process to understand both the history and the future of the company, to be able to communicate that to the bank, to the VC guys or the private equity guys. So we're on polling question number 3 now. Denise?
And Dave, we have a question in the chat too, while we're running this polling question. If you
Okay.
can see it.
Yep. This is a long question.
I know. That's why I didn't want to read it.
Okay. I think I get it.
Yeah, so I saw
Yeah.
that one. Cerebro Capital is a new technology disruptor out there that's actually matching. If you fill out go to their website and fill out a list of questions about what you need. They will provide you with a list of potential financing companies that match your needs. And you can also get one-on-one with John Robinson. He's one of the managing directors of Cerebro, and they could probably help you. Off the top of my head, it would take a little bit of digging to be able to come up with some names, but I can recommend Cerebro.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, Doug. Cerebro Capital is a new entity out there that has both banks and non-bank lenders in their, I guess, stable of lending options. And you can kind of decide which one is the best fit for you. It sort of depends on what you're trying to achieve. I think the question said that, you know, they had a bank line of credit, but they wanted to provide a little bit more liquidity just in case, which is not a bad idea. And Cerebro Capital is one, and there's probably a few others. Like Doug said, if we thought about it for a minute, we could come up with a couple of names.
An intro to John Robinson would be great. I'll follow up with an email to both of you. Thank you.
Sure. Yep. So if you were to engage a fractional CFO, how many hours a week would you expect them to be on the clock? 8 to 24 was the largest response there. And that's probably right. But again, it sort of depends on what your needs are. Small companies that, you know, may have a limited budget may only be looking for 1 to 5 hours a week, if that. Larger companies that have more complex operations and more complex problems because of the more complex operations might need a little bit more time. The nice thing about a fractional CFO is typically you can design the program that fits your needs. And there's really no standard to that. So moving on, I think this is me. The items that typically an owner, an entrepreneur, a CEO of a small company don't have the time to manage are budgets with variance analyses. So, you know, we do budgets for almost all of our clients, and regardless of size. And I think it's an excellent management tool to help the executive team or the CEO, the owner, understand kind of where they are, what they expected to achieve in the next year, and whether or not they're achieving that. So when you look at sales compared to budget or revenues compared to budget, are you meeting budget? Are you exceeding budget? Or are you falling behind what your budget said you wanted to achieve? Are your margins stable or growing? And typically you want to see margins at least stable. If you do have opportunities to grow your margins, you want to see that. And certainly this variance analysis on a monthly or quarterly basis, we recommend monthly if there's enough time to do that. Variance analysis. That's going to tell you what's happening with your margins. And then fixed expenses, you know, that's in this inflationary period, that's becoming, I think, a more and more complex job because all companies are seeing cost inflation, and it's putting pressure on their margins, putting pressure on their profitability. I think we saw Walmart suffered some stock market decline yesterday in the range of 10 or 11% because they had said in their earnings call that inflation is affecting their profitability, and they don't feel like they can pass that on to their consumers. So it's pretty important that you monitor where you are in terms of managing expenses going forward. And then understanding cost versus pricing. I think this is an area that owners, entrepreneurs, small businesses don't often understand, that just because you're covering your cost doesn't mean that you're making a profit. You've got other overhead elements that aren't entering into the product costing, let's say. And then, you know, do you have a product or service that can be value priced or market priced? just because you can. Not saying that it's the right thing to do. We've seen some situations, particularly in the medical field over the last couple of years in the pandemic, where some folks were heavily criticized for price gouging, and certainly nobody wants to be accused of that. But just understanding your cost versus where your pricing is or where your pricing could be, so that you're generating a reasonable return to the investors, to the owner, to the entrepreneur of the company. And then cash flow management, like Doug had mentioned, and cash flow forecasting, the treasury function. You want to make sure you understand what potential shortfalls you may be facing in the next month, the next 3 months, the next 6 months, so that you can arrange for your line of credit, arrange for other kinds of financing controls to be put in place, and cover those potential shortfalls. This is a favorite area because there's so many metrics, key performance indicators out there. I mean, you could measure everything. And what I tell my clients is pick the top 3, 4, 5 items that are the most important to you. If you have too many, you'll never pay attention to what the measures are telling you. So pick the ones that are most important, the ones that are really driving the success of the business, and providing the most informative feedback, because that's what they're supposed to be doing, and use those metrics or KPIs going forward. But obviously there's metrics covering cash, there's metrics covering sales, manufacturing, and operating metrics. Owners who are entrepreneurs, don't often have the experience or the knowledge to kind of come up with these things. I think it takes people with experience like what we have in this group here, the CFO, who can kind of start that discussion and say, okay, what are we trying to achieve? How are we going to measure that? What are the metrics that are going to tell us whether we're effectively achieving those goals or not? And I think the CFO is the person who's best capable of leading that kind of effort going forward. I'm not going to spend much time with these because, you can look them up on the internet, but you can measure sales, you can measure a lot of different ways. And there's a couple of them here. I think, Denise, you're going to make this presentation available afterwards for folks, right? So that if they wanted to go back, they could see any of these items.
Absolutely, Dave.
Okay. But like I mentioned, you can find any number of metrics to measure whatever you want to measure. Again, it's deciding which ones are the most important. And I think the person that has that kind of experience is the CFO, at least to be able to start the conversation, start the discussion. Certainly you want to include people who are in charge of operations areas in the company to help determine what are the most important measures, but come up with the top 3 to 5 measures, because if you have more than that, you just won't have enough time to pay attention to all of them. So there's cash metrics, there's manufacturing metrics, there's development metrics. If you're a startup and all you're doing is spending money, you've got a burn rate that's going on, and you need to cover that from a funding standpoint. But is that what was planned from the beginning, or are you spending more than you thought you might, and you're going to run out of cash quicker? That's not a good place to be. So we're up to polling question number 4. What do you believe a reasonable hourly rate for a fractional CFO would be? Okay, 60% thought $150 to $200 an hour is reasonable. 35% said $300 to $400 an hour, and 5% said $75 an hour. I think this is probably realistic given our marketplace. It kind of depends on the market, kind of depends on the size of the company, kind of depends maybe on the industry a little bit. Certain markets can generate that $300 to $400 an hour pretty easily. I think, in our metro area here, mid-Atlantic area, probably $150 to $250, $300 an hour is not kind of a bad range there. Again, it depends on the experience of the person that you're bringing in and the qualifications that they have and the problems that you anticipate that they will solve for you. So Doug, back to you.
Yes, sir, thanks. So we interjected some slides here on cash flow management because cash flow management is one of the critical issues that we identified earlier to keeping a company in business. It is the lifeblood of any organization, so you have to keep your finger on that pulse. Your financial forecasts can tell you what you think you're going to need over a long period of time, but you also need to understand what's coming in and what's going out, not only today and yesterday, but next week, the week after that, and maybe even the month after that. You should be able to forecast that to understand, hey, am I going to have to tap into that line of credit, or maybe I need to get that line of credit? So there's a lot of reasons you should monitor that cash flow. Most certainly, not least of which is to make sure you don't run out of cash. I remember coming into a company, early stage company down at the BW Tech Incubator. My God, they had built out a whole management team. They had like 7 or 8 employees, and they were running out of cash in 2 weeks. They were behind in their rent. It was a disaster. It's because nobody was looking to match the cash coming in with their expenses. So it's just critical. So you should be monitoring that cash every week, and I would suggest forecasting it and updating that forecast every week. Next slide, please. So monitoring and forecasting, you've got to understand accounts receivable. You have to understand your customers and their payment history. And you have to understand your vendors, and you have to understand what they expect. You can pay your attorneys in 90 days and they're not going to complain too much, but BG&E might want to be paid before 60 days, for example. You got to understand your payroll. Is that ramping up? What's it going to look like in 3 weeks or 4 weeks and 2 months? If you're ramping up that payroll, it's going to have an impact on your cash flow. You've got to prioritize your payment. So, hey, do I pay my friend who's the attorney first, or do I pay the BG&E who might cut off my electricity? And again, forecasting the cash availability is critical. And then communication. So I'm going to pose this question to the group. Why is communication important? Please feel free to chime in. And if you don't, then I'm going to make Dave do it.
Somebody please chime in.
Speaking from experience, when the CEO thinks that he can just go and spend at his own desires without communicating back to the CFO and asking, what are our plans? What is our immediate needs and our long-term needs? You can, without communicating, that CEO just might spend you into a hole.
Absolutely. Anybody else? So I like to stress communication because I've been in companies where, again, I'm a certified turnaround professional, and I've been recruited into companies that were undergoing problems with their bank. The bank said, we don't want to finance you anymore, so you need to find a new lender. I've been in cases like that. Next slide, please. So I've been in companies where there was no communication within the company, within the departments. So the accounts payable department had no idea how much money was coming in. They could look at the checkbook and they could see how much cash was in the checkbook, but they didn't know how much money was going to hit that checkbook in the next 2 weeks. If there was more communication between accounts receivable and accounts payable, that would help. So that's one reason communication is important, besides what Jeff said. And managing cash, as I just kind of said, is a team effort. You have to communicate between receivables, payables, payroll. If you have, oops, that's a misspelling there, inventory purchasing. If you have inventory purchasing, you have to understand what that's going to be looking like going out, say, 3 or 4 weeks. And of course, asset purchases affect cash dramatically, so you better have an idea of what that might look like. And so the whole thing here is somebody has to lead the effort. And in an early stage company, it sure as heck isn't going to be the bookkeeper. So let's go to the next slide. So here, a problem. Why aren't experienced CFOs hired earlier? Well, yeah, you're not going to find a professional CFO probably for less than $150,000 a year. Depending on their experience, it could be $300,000 or more, depending on the size of the company. Controllers are burdened with some CFO work. So rather than hiring a CFO, the owner of the company might say, okay, I want the controller to do more of this, but they're already working 80 hours a week or so, and they can't do any more, and they may not have the experience to do what is required. And the owner may not understand the benefits of financial leadership, particularly at early stages. So next slide. Dave, this is yours.
Got it. What's the solution? Fractional CFO. As I had mentioned earlier, typically the fractional CFO can come in on an as-needed basis, can focus their attention on the items that are the most important, can work with the owner to prioritize what those items are. Rates can be negotiated. Typically, what we've experienced at TCV Growth Partners is between $180 and $220 an hour. And the number of hours, we had a polling question on that earlier. It like I think Jeff responded, it depends, or maybe you responded to a different question, it depends, but it just depends on what the needs are and what the company can afford. So it depends on the stage of where the company is. Small companies, could get by with 5 to 10 hours a month. Larger companies, it may take a little bit more time because of the complexities there. But with a fractional CFO, it's all negotiable. It can all be arranged, but with the benefit of really trying to help the company achieve what is important to it, more so than to the CFO. Typically, those of us in this business, fractional CFO business, are there to help our companies, one, succeed, and two, to grow. And I guess our ideal success is that we work ourselves out of a job. We help our companies get to the size where they can afford to hire that $150,000 to $300,000 a year CFO. I guess I sort of covered this, but the roles and responsibilities of the fractional CFO, we've kind of touched on it throughout the whole presentation. It depends on what's most important to the company and what's most critical with where the company is in its stage. one of the things, a couple of the things that I typically talk with my clients about, and I've got a couple clients that are relatively new and small companies, but are you billing your receivables on time? Are you billing at a rate that covers your costs? And can you increase your billing rates to be market driven or to be market rates? Are you collecting your receivables on time? And are you paying your payables on time? And do you have a cash flow forecast or idea? It may not necessarily be documented, but you need to make sure you have enough of a cushion with cash sources to be able to handle a bit of a hiccup, whether it's lack of collections in accounts receivable over a couple of payroll periods or what it might be. And then, try to establish metrics, whether it's putting a budget together and looking at those variances on a monthly or quarterly basis to see what's going on in the business. And then looking at the revenue trends, the sales trends, what's happening with the company in terms of its growth and what are the financing needs for funding that growth going forward. And like I had mentioned, that our goal at TCV Growth Partners really is to work ourselves out of a job where they can hire the full-time chief financial officer, chief marketing officer, chief operating officer, depending on what our role is in the company that we're working with. So last polling question number 5. What's the best way to find a fractional CFO? Oh, thank goodness. Call TCV Growth Partners. Got the most responses. But, ask business contacts. Yeah, I would do the same thing. I would ask folks we know, who do you know that's in this business? And, would you recommend them if we were interested in bringing somebody on board from that firm as a fractional CFO? Doug?
Yeah, so I want to thank everyone for bearing with us through this presentation. We hope it added value. Dave is a financial leadership partner and myself at TCV Growth Partners. If you know any companies that need help in the areas of marketing leadership, sales leadership, operations, or finance, please get in touch with us because we can help those companies grow to the point where they can find a full-time person. So thank you guys very much.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to thank all my friends for participating in the call today. It's good to see some familiar names and a few familiar faces when you would show your picture out there. So good to see everybody.
If I could just jump in before we end here. Great presentation, guys, and I think this is a trend I've been seeing growing and probably more important than ever with seems to be a lot of new startups now coming out of COVID and all of that they tend to take care of the front end and nobody watches the back end. And as you've mentioned, you sell a product that either you can't afford to sell at that price or the cash flow. So I think it's a great service. But more importantly, for all our guest speakers in situations like this, we like to offer a charitable contribution to the charity of their choice. So if you guys could get to me and agree on a charity that you like, we'll make a donation in the name of your firm.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, we'll get back to you on that. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Well done, guys. Well done.
You.
Thanks, Greg. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks, everybody.
Well done.
Thank you.